I've got a wonderful bottle here that called Shelter Point. It's from Campbell River on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. It's their artisanal single malt whiskey, a 100% barley whiskey, which if you drink Scotch, will be very familiar to you. That is all 100% barley whiskey. Kind of unusual for Canada in that it's a single malt and it's all barley. We have a lot of rye and wheat and all that stuff up here, and specifically a spring 2017 release. So I'm going to run you through all the parts of tasting this. I'm going to talk a little bit about a kind of neat tool I found recently that, oh geez, you're not supposed to touch your face. I always, damn COVID. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about a really neat tool, a Canadian whiskey tasting wheel that I found recently, but mainly talk about like you're not crazy when you find particularly reminiscent flavors in whiskey. They come from real things. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Going to talk a little bit about this whiskey. Some of the deets on this: 46% alcohol by volume at bottling. Typically, when you pick whiskey off the shelf, it's going to be 40 to 43%. This one's a little bit higher, and that is just fine. I am not going to add any water to this one, although I have nothing against adding a drop or a splash at all to the right whiskey. Bit of the backstory on this one, too, while I pull up my Glencairn glass, as usual for tasting. Bit of the backstory on this one. So Shelter Point is a farm distillery out on Vancouver Island. Definitely part of that movement of, oh geez, I can't open a bottle. Definitely part of that movement of craft distilling. There is no age statement on this. I don't know exactly how long they've been around. Mind you, this bottling is from 2017, so it has been around a while. I can say one thing I can't say, I don't know what this was aged in. It's got a very light honey color, which makes me think bourbon barrel or maybe some virgin oak. I don't know. I did read another blogger on this one who did suggest they were actually aged in was it Jim Beam barrels? Something in that range. Jack Daniels barrels. That was it. That's speculative. I have no clue. But just guessing from the lighter color and the aroma that's very bready, it's probably not got much sherry or other sort of European kinds of Scotch flavors to it. Okay, so again, point of this show, walk you along the process. There's 3 parts of tasting whiskey. First of all, there's pouring it. I am the shakiest guy around, always have been. There's nothing wrong with me. Well, at least that's not one of the particular things wrong with me. Boop. Okay, so the face touching again. Got an itchy nose. What can you do? So, first thing is the nose. Quite convenient. So, nose is to just catch some of the gas that comes off of that whiskey. Aside from the alcohol, you're going to catch some different compounds on there. Sometimes whiskey is going to taste the same as the nose. Sometimes it's going to taste completely different. Then there's the palate. And here's a big misconception I've called out when I've done shows like this in the past. By the way, I started this as a Facebook Live show largely for friends, but I started gaining enough momentum, gaining enough views. I'm like, hey, maybe I've got something here. I'm going to share with the broader world. Nonetheless, one misconception, and I think of my dad, who's a guy who's drank rye for years and years and years and years, but until I started drinking whiskey straight, he was a rye and coke guy, and largely still is. But to him, if I gave him a glass like this, especially when I first started out, he would just take this and slug it and be like, oh, well, I guess that was smooth. Well, yeah, it's going to be terrible when you pound back whiskey. You're getting, speaking of just getting the smell of something, no matter how smooth it is, if you just pound it back, all you're getting is the alcohol spice. That's the only thing that has time to hit your nose and your tongue and all that before it's gone down. So you're only getting the harshest part by shooting whiskey. Don't shoot whiskey. I mean, even cheap whiskey, like, yeah, and you're going to hear about my dear old Alberta Premium, a 100% rye whiskey that's about $1 an ounce, better even if it's on sale. That's actually quite delicious for an unbelievable price. Stuff that people normally mix or shoot. You don't have to spend a lot to get a whiskey that you can sip. It's about actually taking the time to sip it. So when I talk about palate, it's like rolling that whiskey back and forth on your tongue, letting that flavor just hang around for a while before you actually drink it back, which would be the finish. And if you take that time, you're going to notice that the palate and the finish even can taste different on a whiskey. So there is really those 3 steps to it. Again, if you're a person who's been drinking and tasting whiskey a lot, right, whatever. I'm giving the basics. I'm sticking with the people here. I'm a whiskey populist, you could say. So back to this particular one, Shelter Point. And, I'm not super solid on my tasting notes in that I will pull out some weird ones. I'm not overly concerned what you think about them. Although I'm always interested to see what you think about the whiskey itself, not my tasting notes. The show I did recently, I talked about a whiskey tasting like lake water, or being reminiscent of me sitting on the dock out of my parents' cottage back in Manitoba when I was growing up. As a flavor, that's kind of wacky. Whatever. It's what I taste, and I respect whatever you taste in it. So I'm just going to stick my nose in this one. I'm going to talk about what I think I find in it. So right away, it's bready. And the other reason I know I'm totally not off on this, my wife, Linda, who I'll probably talk about a few times in these different episodes, there's the face touching again. Man, it's hard to change habits. So Linda does not drink alcohol. She's allergic to alcohol. If I give her anything, it usually, like to taste or mainly even to smell, she'll say, oh, it just smells like alcohol. When I cracked this bottle open, she was just sitting beside me on the couch and just removing the bottle around. She caught whiff of it and she's like, oh, that smells like sourdough. This smells like sourdough. A little bit sour, definitely yeasty. Now you add, say some, it's like if you made a sourdough loaf, but you had put some some apples in it. And maybe a bit of honey. So it's got a little bit of that sweetness, but very bready off the top in a very nice way. And the other thing is, like I mentioned before, this is kind of unique for Canadian whiskey. It's 100% barley. Now, typically Canadian whiskeys are made with a blend of different base alcohols, which is kind of one of the things that makes Canadian whiskey awesome. We don't have that pretense of it having to be corn or having to be barley. We have rye, which is largely, well, it's not unique to Canada, but it's very popular, almost always in the mix up here, whether it's 100% rye or just part of a blend. We do a lot of blending, so there's lots of different boozes that go into this stuff. But barley, having it 100% barley and being more like Scotch whiskey is made, it comes across a lot like a Speyside Scotch whiskey, which in Scotch world, I'm very much a Speyside, not an Islay person. You're not going to catch me doing a lot of smoky whiskeys on here. Yeah, cereal, maybe some Cheerios, multigrain Cheerios. My 3-year-old, if you see stuff around the house, I have a 3-year-old. This is real life whiskey right here. My 3-year-old eats a lot of multigrain Cheerios. It has that kind of smell to it. Anyways, very nice. Now, before I get to the palate, to hold you in suspense, so the Canadian Whiskey Wheel, what was great about this, the Whiskey Wheel, I'm just going to pull up for my own reference here. The Canadian Whiskey Flavor Wheel was put together by Dr. Don Livermore, who is a master blender with Hiram Walker and Sons. So those are the folks that make J.P. Wiser's, Lot 40, some good Canadian whiskeys. What he did is broke down all of the flavor compounds that can come from the yeast, the grain, or the wood that the whiskey is aged in. And what's neat is that, and I'm talking about dozens of flavor compounds that truly whiskey will have in common with actual food. So when you smell something that smells like banana bread, and if you go to a distillery, that can be an overwhelming smell. And when you go into the mash room and that, though there are really chemical compounds in common there. So it's not coming out of thin air. But it does, in his chart, pertain to like, does that come from the yeast, whatever. And like for yeast, the flavors range from like that earthy, spoiled mushroom kind of scent to like fruity, like green apple. Grain, which I'm talking a lot about, rye, known for being spicy. Barley, known for being very mellow, sweet, bready. And others being, well, different combinations. And then, of course, what barrel it's aged in. I don't know how far to go back in like novice whiskey here. Whiskey's aged in barrels, often multiple kinds of barrels to get different flavors. That all blends in. But the flavor range in all of this is ranges from fruit to rotting things to leather to things that aren't even edible, but come with a certain smell, a certain chemical that makes you think of something. So to smell like something like cereal in here, it makes a lot of sense. It comes from similar grains. Okay, so I think it's just neat to look at a flavor wheel like this, not to like bias. You don't want to like taste something like this and then just look at the wheel and be like, well, which one did I find? Again, it's a story. It's what matters to you. It's what you remember. It's what your favorite flavors are that you find in here, and that's wonderful. That's part of the enjoyment of all this. But what I did find helpful with this is to say, oh, I've definitely tasted apple in whiskeys before. Where the heck does that come from? Just remind yourself that this is, whatever you're tasting is legit. So getting on with the actual tasting on the palate here. See, and this is one you definitely get different notes on the finish than on the palate. The palate has, it's got a little bit of like raisins to it. It's got, and there's an initial kind of burst of sweetness that comes with it. But then that sweetness gives way pretty quickly to some earthier flavors. I was thinking about things like, there's a little bit of clove, actually allspice. I was sniffing a little bit of that. I was huffing allspice the other night after I had my first drink of this, and it was really reminiscent, where you have those kind of fall or dessert spices that are on their own not sugared. They're not sweet like that, but they have like almost like a combination of a little bit of sugar and a little bit of cumin or something earthy underneath it. And this has a lot of that going on. I wouldn't quite call it meaty. The distillery pumps that it's got a little bit of sea air, a little bit of sea saltiness to it. I think that's part of that, the whiskey bullshit story. Which I get it. It's romance, and romance sells. Having been to Scotland before and been to a number of distilleries, they sell the romance of whiskey, and that's part of the fun of it. So I won't begrudge them. I'm not sure I get sea air out of this. But not a lot of hint of medicine or anything like that. It's definitely a younger whiskey. Somewhere between when you kind of roll it across your tongue and when you drink it back, you do get a little bit of the burst of that medicinal flavor that comes from just the ethanol in the alcohol. So this is, again, with no age statement. If I had to guess, this is probably aged 3 to 6 years. I wouldn't put it at like 12 plus kinds of years that some of the more mature whiskeys would be in. This would be fantastic after, I'm sure after that much time, but this is still very, very good. Yeah, so the rest of the, just to finish off the palate there, um, I do get a little bit of that sea salt, a little bit of that dessert. I get a little bit of even green, like rosemary, uh, or dill, some legit green herbs in there. Very subtle though. Up front is really presenting as that like allspice, baking spice kind of profile, but without any cloying kind of sweetness, which I think is a good thing. It's not that I'm against whiskeys that come across a bit sweeter, but I also don't like a dessert whiskey. If I want something desserty, I'm going to go with rum. I'm going to go with something that's legitimately sweeter. But the finish is what's really interesting here to me. Because here's where you get a burst of coffee giving way to a burst of, and like really at this point, like a few seconds after drinking, I just chewed on a piece of steak. Juicy red meat, that like steak, not even blood, that steak juice, that melted fat that comes out of a delicious piece of steak, that's hanging around on the back of my palate, which is a really neat and delicious sensation. It's actually making my mouth water. It's awesome. Now, one thing I'll comment on, this has got a very velvety, oily sort of texture. Now, I'll hold up the glass. You probably won't be able to see it, but not even a lot of legs on this because it's really coating the glass. Some whiskeys are very watery and will run down right away, almost look like you splashed water in it. This one hangs around, so it's got a nice body to it that I really like. Mm. Oh, I missed a little bit of pepper on the palate too. But yeah, going back, there's some coffee and cocoa there as well at that first rush, followed by those juicy meaty flavors. Maybe like a really dry red wine, but without the tannin kind of puckering that you get afterward. Um, so overall, you've got a whiskey here that's got kind of three really distinct phases. The nose is different than the palate, and it's different than the finish, which um, so this is a great whiskey if you're starting out. It's very approachable, and like the flavors are very nice uh, and gentle, and nothing that's going to put you off. But because it's got those three phases, and you really can pick them out, sip this back and you'll find and look for and find more and find more. And that to me is the pleasure of whiskey, is sitting back for 5, 10 minutes, half an hour, and just finding something new every time you sip it. Again, whatever you find is totally legit, but this one's got a lot of things to find. So again, Shelter Point, this price wise comes in between 65 and $80 depending on where you buy it per bottle for a 26-ounce bottle, which I think, again, very reasonable. And, short of it maybe being aged for a little bit longer, I would put it up against easily a lot of 12-year-old Scotch whiskies, if not 15-year-olds, and say, blind taste test. I think people might enjoy this better. So Shelter Point did a fantastic job on this whiskey. I'm really enjoying it, and this is, like I said, my second time drinking it. I'm enjoying it as much as the first time. This is a great bottle to start if you want to follow along with me. Go find yourself a bottle of Shelter Point, the single malt, 100% barley whiskey. Grab a bottle, enjoy it, and come back for more of my shows. I've got a few lined up in the queue here, and I'm always getting new bottles in, also taking suggestions. So focusing on Canadian whiskey, telling a little bit of the story. I think my next episode, I've got a Pike Creek 21-year-old. So we're going to go down that other like higher end, and it's got some European oak aging on it. So there's some bigger flavors and a little bit older age statements. So maybe something even a bit bolder than this. And maybe use that opportunity to talk about a little bit about the whiskey making process for those of you who are uninitiated, and share a little bit more. I'm looking forward to sharing more of this with you. Even once we get out of lockdown, I may just sit here and drink a lot of whiskey with you. So thank you for joining, and we will see you soon.